Let's talk about the real story of Samhain and why it's more interesting than you might think. A 10-year-old warrior stands between an entire kingdom and a fire-breathing monster with magic lullaby powers. A man helps a corpse get a drink of water and accidentally time travels. A headless horseman carries his own severed head under his arm and uses a human spine as a whip. These aren't Netflix originals. These aren't even folk tales that got exaggerated over time. These are actual ancient stories behind Halloween. And trust me, the truth is a lot more interesting and way cooler than just people dressing up to scare ghosts. So let's start with what Samhain actually was. And I might blow your mind right out of the gate. See this? This is Newgrange in Ireland. It's a passage tomb that's over 5,000 years old. That makes it older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Stonehenge. And here's the kicker. It's perfectly aligned so that on Samhain morning, the sunrise illuminates the inner chamber. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Celts didn't arrive in Ireland until somewhere between 2500 and 500 BCE. That means Samhain, this festival that we call Celtic, actually predates the Celts by at least 2,000 years. When Celtic-speaking peoples arrived in Ireland, they didn't invent Samhain, they inherited it from whoever built these incredible structures. It'd be so cool if we knew who these people were. The Neolithic people who lived here were already marking this time astronomically for thousands of years. So when people say ancient Celtic festival, they're technically wrong. It's more like ancient mystery people's festival that the Celts just took and ran with. But I guess Neolithic astronomical observers festival doesn't really fit on a Starbucks cup. Okay, first things first. Let's talk about how to actually say this word. Okay, because a lot of people get this weird, especially this time of year. It's pronounced Samhain or Samhain, like cow or ah, like Samhain, Cowin, Samhain. It's not Samhain or anything like that, because the MH in Samhain in Irish Gaelic makes more of a W sound. So Samhain or Samhain sounds like Samhain. So here's something that'll help you understand the season. Samhain literally means summer's end. That's it, in Irish Gaelic. The word comes from an Old Irish word, samo, meaning summer, and fuin, meaning end. Summer's end. Sa, wind. That's it. It's basically an Irish word for the beginning of November. Different Celtic regions had different names for it, of course. In Scotland, they called it Savin, with more of a V sound instead of a W. In Wales, it was Colin In Brittany, similar, it was Colin. And in Cornwall, it was named Allantide. But they all fell on about the same date, October 31st going into November 1st. Now, to understand why Samhain mattered so much, you need to understand what life was like for agricultural people in ancient Ireland and Scotland. This wasn't just a party, this was literally about survival. By late October, the harvest was complete. You had gathered everything you were going to eat for the next 6 months, really. There were no grocery stores, no refrigeration, except for, outside in the freezing cold. What you had stored was what you had, period. This was also a time when you brought your livestock in from summer pastures. And here's somewhat of a grim reality. Most of the animals that wouldn't survive the winter on stored feed, whatever you could store to feed them over the winter, they had to be slaughtered now, like right now. So Samhain was an assessment time for these people. You looked at your stores and you calculated, will this make it to spring? If not, you slaughtered those animals. You preserved the meat. You came together as a community because your survival depended on it. The ancient Celts didn't divide their year into 4 seasons like we do. They had 2 major seasons, the light half and the dark half. Summer, which was Bealtaine to Samhain, was the growing season, the light half of the year, and a time of growth and fertility. In winter, or Samhain to Bealtaine, was the dark half, the time of dormancy and survival. And Samhain stood right at the threshold between those 2 seasons. It belonged fully to neither. It existed outside of time. It was liminal space. Now, combine all of this. Nature is visibly dying around you. Trees are losing their leaves. Fields are bare. Days are getting shorter very fast. And I mean fast in those northern latitudes. The days really, it was dropping every day, the length of the sunlight. I mean, people are genuinely getting anxious about whether or not they'll survive the next 6 months. You put all that together, add some communal bonfires and some alcohol, maybe some darkness following earlier each day, and of course people started believing that the boundary between the living and the dead got much thinner. Of course, supernatural things became possible. This wasn't superstition separate from reality. This was reality. Alright, how about some myth busting? And we're going to start with the biggest, most persistent lie about Samhain, okay? Samhain was not a Celtic god of death. Let me say that again, louder for the people in the back. There is no Celtic deity named Samhain. Zero, nada, none. This was completely made up in the 18th century. Protestant writers who were afraid of paganism made this up. They invented a god of death named Samhain, and somehow this lie has persisted for close to 200 years, maybe more. I got to do the math. Go ahead, look through all Celtic mythology. Check the archaeological record. Read the medieval Irish manuscripts as much as you can. You will not find a single god named Samhain. It's a modern thing because Samhain is not a name of an individual. It's the Irish word for summer's end. It's the start of November. Now, the Celts did have deities associated with death. Dawn, for example, or other regional equivalents, but none of them were called Samhain, and the festival wasn't necessarily focused on any one deity. Imagine if 2,000 years from now, people thought Christmas was the name of a god. The ancient Christians worshipped a great deity, Christmas, who gave gifts to children and demanded cookies and milk as offerings. That's basically what they did. They spun this story for their own benefit. Now, another question that kind of goes along with this, did Druids perform human sacrifices at Samhain? The answer is, we honestly don't know. But probably not the way that they were portrayed out to be. Here's what we actually have as evidence. There are some Irish bog bodies, ancient preserved corpses found in the peat bogs, who show signs of possible ritual killing. Some of them may date to around Samhain time, but that's speculation based on circumstantial evidence and doesn't hold much weight in the academic community or in the spiritual community. We also have medieval Irish literature that mentions ritual sacrifices in stories, but here's the thing. Those are stories written by Christian monks centuries after the fact, recording tales that have been passed down orally. That's not exactly the same as historical documentation, and it is subject to change. And just like the satanic panic of the 70s and 80s, it is changed. So, what is documented? There's massive animal slaughter at Samhain, but that wasn't a sacrifice to the gods necessarily. That was practical necessity. If you couldn't feed an animal through winter, you killed it for meat now and preserved it. Those bones went into a bonfire or a bonfire. That's not necessarily religious sacrifice. That's survival with ritual. And let me be absolutely crystal clear about this. The vast majority of modern pagans do not practice sacrifice of any kind. Not animal sacrifice and definitely not human sacrifice. There are some pagan practices that will sacrifice animals, but that is a high-level practice and it's not for everyone. As I mentioned, that satanic panic fears from the 70s and 80s were thoroughly investigated and completely debunked. Actual modern pagans find these accusations offensive and damaging. Again, pagans do not sacrifice babies to Samhain gods. Modern pagan practice involves honoring ancestors, spirits, and deities, celebrating nature cycles, and personal spiritual growth. That's it. Here's where some of this Samhain stuff gets a little complicated, so stay with me. Everyone says that the Catholic Church deliberately moved All Saints' Day to November 1st to suppress or steal pagan Samhain, right? It's been passed around on social media, TikTok, YouTube, all this. You've probably heard this story 1,000 times. But here's the thing. That's a really too simple of an explanation, and probably wrong. Here's some of the facts. Pope Boniface IV established All Saints' Day on May 13th in the year of 609 CE. And it stayed on May 13th for over 200 years. Then in 835 CE, Pope Gregory IV moved it to November 1st. But here's the crucial detail everyone leaves out. He did this at the request of German churches. German, not Irish, not Scottish, not any Celtic region. Germany didn't celebrate Samhain. or have anything that was, close to it. The Germanic people had their own autumn festivals, but they weren't Samhain. So why would the church move All Saints' Day to suppress a festival requested by somebody who did not celebrate that festival? It didn't make sense. It wasn't even in the right region that requested the change, right? The actual motivation seems to have been practical. Cooler autumn weather made it easier for pilgrims to travel to Rome. That's really it. That's the boring truth. Now, did some blending happen in Celtic regions where both All Saints' Day and Samhain fell in the same time? Probably, yeah, I would say so. But that was organic cultural evolution happening locally, not deliberate church policy to suppress paganism. And All Souls' Day, that's November 2nd, was established even later on, somewhere around the 11th century. That one may have absorbed more Samhain elements than even All Saints' Day did. Here's a better story. Halloween is not Christianized Samhain. It's a beautiful, messy hybrid of Celtic harvest festivals, Christian liturgical calendar, medieval folk traditions, Victorian social customs, Irish, Scottish immigration to America kind of implemented some of this, and 20th century commercialization. Each layer added something new and different. That's way more interesting than a simple, Christian takeover pagan holiday story. And it's actually what happened. By the way, the name Halloween is explicitly Christian. All Hallows Eve, the evening before All Saints' Day, is a name that was a Christian name and not just paganism in disguise. Okay? Let's get into some of these epic stories that kind of center around this time of year. For 23 years, Ireland had a serious problem. Every single Samhain, a creature named Ailinn emerged from the other world and attacked Tara, which is a royal high seat of the kings of Ireland. This wasn't a minor nuisance, this was an existential threat to the kingdom. Ailinn's trick was brilliant and terrifying. He would play his magical lyre, and the music would put everyone to sleep. Every guard, every warrior, every person just asleep. And then, while they were unconscious, Ailinn would breathe fire and burn everything down. For 23 years, nobody could stop him. Nobody could stay awake through the music. Enter Fionn mac Cúil. He's a 10-year-old boy, and he volunteers to end this nightmare. Now, Fionn was clever. He got his hands on a magical weapon called the Spear of Fiacha. I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but I think that's it. The spear had a special property. If you pressed its blade to your forehead and inhaled the fumes it gave off, you could not fall asleep. So, Samhain comes, Ailinn arrives, the magical music starts playing. Everyone falls asleep, everyone except Fionn, who's standing there with the spear pressed to his forehead, fully awake and ready. Ailinn breathes fire, Fionn dodges, and then Fionn kills the monster. But here's where it gets very Celtic. Fionn doesn't just kill Ailinn, he cuts off his head and brings it back to the High King as proof. And yes, he brought back the head specifically because, and this is interesting, because ancient Celts had what historians called a cult of the head. Taking the heads of defeated enemies was like collecting trophies, but kind of metal. They believed that the head contained the soul and power of the person. The story comes from medieval Irish literature, specifically a text called, and again I might butcher this pronunciation, but Macni Vara Finn, The Boyhood Deeds of Fionn. It was written by Christian monks, probably in the 11th or 12th century, recording much older oral traditions. What the story shows us is how Samhain functioned in Celtic mythology. It's when borders or boundaries thinned and supernatural threats can emerge from the other world, and when heroes are able to prove themselves. This next story is pretty wild. It's the adventures of Nera, or in Irish, Ectru Neri. And it dates to somewhere between the 8th and 10th century, making it one of the earliest time travel stories in world history. Yeah, this is time travel. It's really cool. So here's how it goes. King Ailill of Connaught has a challenge for his warriors on Samhain night. Go outside to the gallows where corpses hang and tie a willow twig around the foot of one of them. The first person to do it gets a prize. Everyone's too afraid, nobody wants to do it, except this one guy, Nera, who says, "Sure, I'll do it." Brave guy right there. So Nera goes out into the dark on Samhain night. He approaches the hanging corpses. He ties the willow twig around one's foot. And the corpse comes alive. The corpse speaks to Nera and says, "I'm thirsty. I need water. Carry me on your back so I can get a drink." And Nera, because apparently he's having a strange night and just wants to roll with it, carries this corpse on his back while it directs him to houses where it can drink water. After the corpse has had its drink and Nera returns it to the gallows, Nera heads back to the fort. And this is where it gets pretty fucked up. The fort's destroyed. Buildings are burned. Everyone is dead. Their heads cut off. Nera sees an army of otherworldly beings leaving the scene. In shock, he follows them. They go into a fairy mound, one of those ancient burial mounds scattered across the island that are believed to be entrances to the other world. Nera goes in after them. Inside the mound, he meets a woman from the other world. She explains what's happening. What Nera saw hasn't happened yet. It's a vision of what will happen next Samhain if the fort isn't warned and defended. Nera stays in the fairy mound for what feels like a long time, years even. He marries the woman, they have a life together, but time works differently there. Eventually, Nera returns to the mortal world, and when he emerges from the mound, no time has passed at all. He's back on the same Samhain night that he left. To prove what he's seen, he brings back a golden primrose, a flower that doesn't exist in the mortal world at that time of year. He warns the king, the fort is defended, and the attack is prevented. But here's the ending. Nera goes back into the fairy mound to be with his otherworldly wife, and he stays there forever. This story captures on so many beliefs: the thin boundary between worlds, time operating differently in liminal spaces, the fairy mounds as literal portals, the idea that Samhain exists outside of time. And it's a genuine ancient story, not a Victorian invention. This is 8th to 10th century Irish literature. You want to hear something a little bit more spooky for this time of year? Let me introduce you to the Dullahan. Picture this. A headless horseman rides a massive black horse through the night. But unlike most headless horsemen, yeah, there's a lot of those out there, the Dullahan isn't missing his head, he's carrying it under his arm, and the head is still alive. Let me describe this head to you because the details do matter. The flesh looks like moldy cheese mixed with old leather. The skin is yellowed and papery, the eyes dart around like flies, seeing everything in all directions, and the mouth is locked in a permanent rictus grin that stretches from ear to ear. Oh, and the Dullahan carries a whip. And guess what it's made of? A human spine. An actual human spine that he uses as a whip. Here's how the Dullahan operates. When he stops riding and halts his horse in front of a location, someone at that place is about to die. He speaks only once per journey. He calls the doomed person's name. And when he speaks their name, they die instantly. If you see him approaching, don't try to run inside and lock your door. Gates and locks will burst open at his approach. Don't watch him pass, because he'll throw a basin of blood in your face or use that spine whip to lash out your eyes. So what do? Well, he has exactly one weakness. Gold, don't we all? Even a single gold pen will drive him away. So basically, inflation is the Dullahan's worst enemy. This figure probably evolved from older Celtic deities. Some scholars think he might be connected to Crom Dubh, an ancient fertility god whose worship allegedly involved human sacrifice by decapitation. When Christianity ended this practice, the frustrated god supposedly transformed into this death-bringing entity in folk memory. That's one story. And here's a fun fact. This folklore directly inspired Washington Irving when he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. If you notice that there were some similarities with the story, that's where they come from. The Dullahan came to America through Irish immigration and became what we know as the Headless Horseman. This Irish folklore literally shaped American culture and American stories as well. Let me quickly introduce you to a couple of more characters from Samhain lore. I love these stories. In my research for this video, I was reading up as many of these stories as I could, and some of these I had, put in here just because I wanted to tell them. The puka is a shape-shifting trickster fairy. He appears most commonly as a sleek black horse with golden eyes and a wild mane. They can also become a goat, a cat, a rabbit, a dog, eagle, or a goblin. His favorite trick is appearing as a beautiful horse and enticing someone to climb on his back. And then he takes them for the wildest, most terrifying ride of their life. He'll gallop over cliffs, through rivers, through impossible terrain, but unlike the Scottish Kelpie who drowns his riders, the puka won't kill you, he just wants to scare you thoroughly. The puka also speaks human language and sometimes gives helpful advice if he's in a good mood. Only one person ever successfully rode a puka, Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, who used a special bridle with 3 hairs from the puka's own tail. Oh, and here's the practical side of the story. Any crops left in fields after November 1st were considered puka, or fairy blasted, and therefore inedible. So the puka enforced harvest completion. So get your crops in by Samhain or lose them. So it was kind of like incentive to get all your stuff stored before winter came. And another fun fact with this character, the puka, directly inspired Shakespeare's Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So there's a lot of cultural blending for that Shakespearean story. Oh, and then there's the Kaliak, or Kylok, depending on the region that you're from. She's an ancient divine hag who literally rules winter and determines its length and how harsh it is. Picture a giantess with a blue face, wild white hair, one eye, rust-colored teeth, and a massive hammer. She created the mountains and hills of Ireland and Scotland by dropping rocks from her apron as she strode about the landscape. These rocks are still there. You can see them. At Samhain, her reign begins. In Scotland, she washes her great plaid, a massive piece of cloth, in the Gulf of Corryvreckan whirlpool for 3 days, creating massive storms. When she's finished washing and the plaid comes out white, snow covers the land and winter has fully arrived. The Kaliak is older than the Celts. She appears in myths across Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. Some scholars see connections to the Hindu goddess Kali, meaning that she predates everything. And here's another fun detail. The last sheaf of grain from the harvest was traditionally made into a corn doll, or corn dolly, representing the Kaliak. So she wasn't just a story, she was part of active ritual practice. And that's cool. These aren't just Halloween decorations, they are how ancient people explained real phenomena, why crops failed, why winter came early or late, why scary things happened in the dark when the boundaries were thinning during this time of year. So we've talked about the Irish and the Celts a lot and touched a little bit into some of the Germanic peoples, but what about other cultures? Here's something that might blow your mind. While the Celts were celebrating Samhain in Ireland and Scotland, completely separate cultures around the world were doing something very similar at the exact same time of year. Like independently, completely without contact, different continents, same basic festival. Let's talk about it. In Scandinavia, the Norse celebrated Veturnatur, which means winter nights. This happened mid to late October as a 3-day festival marking summer's transition to winter. Does it sound familiar? Yeah. Just like Samhain, winter nights involved bringing livestock in from summer pastures, large-scale animal slaughter, of course, community feasting, athletic competitions, and offerings to protective spirits and ancestors. But here's where Norse traditions get really interesting around this time. Within the winter nights period, they celebrated specific rituals called Alfablot and Disablot. Alfablot, or elven sacrifice, elven blood, centered on honoring male ancestors, household spirits called the Alfar. These weren't like cute fantasy elves. They were understood as ancestral spirits who protected the family and the home. And here's another fascinating detail. Alfablot was private and secretive. It was administered primarily by the women of the household. We know this because an 11th century poet, Sighvatur Thordarson, wrote about being turned away from Swedish homesteads during the Alphabloat because it was sacred family business. Then we have Disablot, which specifically honored female ancestors and protective spirits called the Disir. These were powerful female entities, protective but also dangerous if not properly respected. We'll go into detail of those in another video. We're not going to get really deep into those in this video right now. But what makes these Norse traditions particularly valuable is that, unlike Celtic sources, we have some detailed saga literature written by people who actually witnessed these practices, which is more than we can say for a lot of cultures that were colonized. Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 13th century, named winter nights as one of the 3 major holidays of the Norse people. Modern Asatru and heathen communities still celebrate winter nights as a holy tide of love, loss, and memory, with feast preparations, ancestor altars, and offerings to protective spirits. Next, let's head to east into Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Russia, and Ukraine. Throughout these regions, people celebrated the Dziady, which translates to Forefathers' Eve or Ancestors' Evening. This name comes from the Proto-Slavic Dziad, meaning grandfather or ancestor. Dziady occurs throughout October and November and represents a communion of the living with the dead through cemetery visits, ritual meals, candles, and offerings. What's remarkable about Dziady is its continuity. We have 15th century documentation that's the Historia Polonica, describing these practices. They're not modern reconstructions. They actually survived colonization. Here's a unique feature. Beggars called Dziady served as intermediaries between the living and the dead. Feeding these beggars was understood as feeding the ancestors themselves. This literally created a built-in social welfare system alongside spiritual observance, which is really cool. Those things kind of coincide, and we need more of this in more modern times, but moving on. And this tradition is still very much alive in these places. On November 1st and 2nd, Polish cemeteries become seas of light as families place thousands and thousands of candles on graves. It's visually stunning and deeply moving. In Belarus, Dziady became a symbol of remembrance for victims of communism. The tradition adapted to honor contemporary losses while maintaining its ancient roots. That's so cool. Lithuanian and Latvian traditions show us how pre-Christian ancestor worship adapted to Christian calendar dates while maintaining its traditional pagan essence. The period from late September through early November was considered a period of the dead for them, when boundaries between worlds thinned. Common theme here. Families performed elaborate cemetery rituals with candles, flowers, and food offerings. Here's one of the significant things about the practice of feeding the dead. It persisted despite centuries of Christian opposition. We have 17th century church records of priests trying desperately to suppress these pagan customs. The church tried for hundreds of years, and they spectacularly failed. Today, Lithuanian and Latvian cemeteries become stunning displays of candlelight on November 1st and 2nd, creating one of Europe's most beautiful spiritual observances. Modern Remuva, that's the Baltic pagan revival movement, celebrates, excuse the pronunciation, Velinese as explicitly a pre-Christian ancestor veneration, maintaining connections to agricultural cycles and beliefs about the relationship between honoring the dead and ensuring fertility for the coming year. Now let's jump across the Atlantic into Mexico and the southwestern U.S. Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead. If you're familiar with the show Wednesday, there's a little bit of connection there. But it demonstrates how indigenous Mesoamerican practices syncretically merge with Catholic traditions to create something wholly unique. I'm going to go ahead and, again, pronunciations. These are not my native language, so I'm going to do this the best I can. But the Aztec festival, Micahuitl, originally occurred in August, honoring Micatasíhuatl, the Lady of the Dead. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they encountered elaborate skull imagery, dancing, and joyful death celebrations. Naturally, the Spanish were horrified. This wasn't how Christians were supposed to relate to death. It was supposed to be somber, not joyful. So the church moved and shortened the celebration to coincide with All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day on November 1st and 2nd. But here's what's important. The people adapted but never surrendered. They took Christian calendar dates and continued their indigenous practices within that framework. What survived and thrives today is absolutely remarkable. These elaborate ofrendas, or home altars with photographs of deceased loved ones, their favorite foods, and marigolds called cempasúchil that guide souls home. Pan de Muerto, or bread of the dead, calaveras, or sugar skulls decorated with names, La Catrina imagery connecting death to social commentary, and unlike European death traditions that tend toward somber mourning, Dia de los Muertos is a joyful celebration. It's a celebration of, death is acknowledged as natural, ancestors are welcomed back home, and life is affirmed through laughter, music, and community. In 2008, UNESCO designated Day of the Dead as intangible cultural heritage. It shows 3,000 years of cultural continuity from pre-Columbian codices through Spanish colonialism that exist into present day. And of course, Pixar's Coco in 2017 introduced millions of people worldwide to these customs, showing how ancient traditions remain vibrantly relevant even today. So the big question. Why? Why did the Celts in Ireland, the Norse in Scandinavia, the Slavs in Eastern Europe, the Balts on the Baltic Sea, and the Aztecs in Mesoamerica all independently develop nearly identical festivals at the same time of year? Because every single one of those involves honoring ancestors and the dead, harvest completion and winter prep, livestock slaughter, season becoming a sacred time, beliefs about boundaries between the worlds thinning, fire and light used for protection and guidance, community feasting, social bonding, and even divination and looking toward the future. These cultures had no contact with each other. They were separated by oceans and thousands of miles, and yet they all did basically the same thing. Either this is a universal human response to seasonal change and winter anxiety, or there's ancient cultural diffusion that we don't understand. Could be both, could be neither. It could be something core spiritually in us that we all have this connection. I think it's a mix of all that. Because here's the thing, watching nature die and experiencing days getting shorter and shorter, facing genuine scarcity, survival anxiety, these are universal human experiences this time of year, and something that brings us together spiritually and culturally, even if we have different cultures and different traditions, around the world. But these are things that bring us all together. Our ancestors weren't stupid. They were observing the same phenomena that we observe today, and they responded with meaning making. They responded with community building and spiritual practices. That's fucking beautiful, and that's human. So now we're going to move a little forward in time. We're going to kind of put the ancient traditions to the side now. We're going to, get into more modern stuff with Halloween and this time of year. So you may ask, how do we get from ancient fire festivals and ancestor veneration to trick-or-treating and candy corn? And if you love it, you love it. If you don't, you don't. It's one of those divisive candies, and I'm team candy corn. Put in the comments, are you team candy corn or not? Kind of curious to see what people say. This transition has a very specific turning point. Late 1800s, 1870, somewhere around there. Around that year, there was Godey's Ladies Book, a hugely influential women's magazine, published an article that essentially transformed Halloween from a rowdy folk festival into proper Victorian parlor party. The Victorians looked at this ancient threshold festival about death and survival and said, what if we make it about finding a husband or a wife? I'm not joking. The Victorian era turned Halloween into a matchmaking festival for adults. And that's kind of the where we get a lot of this, young adults, having Halloween parties thing. Suddenly, you have elaborate party games with divination purposes, bobbing for apples to see who you'll marry, looking into mirrors by candlelight to see your future husband's face, kale pulling rituals where the shape of the root predicted characteristics of your future partner. Yeah, I'm not making this up. This really happened. The Victorians also added the Gothic aesthetic that we recognize today, decorations with ghosts and skeletons, black cats and bats. They made it romantic and spooky and completely socially acceptable. This was when Halloween became an adult social occasion with dinner parties, games, and courtship rituals. The whole spooky, cute vibe we associate with Halloween, that comes from the Victorian era. Halloween as we know it today, though, is an American invention from the early to mid 20th century. Irish and Scottish immigration to America brought Halloween traditions, but of course they evolved dramatically once they got here. Trick-or-treating as a widespread organized practice emerged between the 20s and the 50s. Before that, Halloween in America was actually kind of a problem. Before that, it was mostly young people, teenage boys, would engage in pranks and just tomfoolery that often crossed the line into vandalism. Communities wanted to redirect that energy, so they created organized activities for these young children and teenagers. They promoted the ideas of kids in costumes going door to door for treats as a wholesome alternative to these destructive pranks. The candy industry saw an opportunity and ran with it. After World War II, when sugar rationing ended, candy companies heavily promoted Halloween as a candy-giving holiday. By the 1950s, that's what it became. Mass-produced costumes appeared in 1950s and 60s, making Halloween more accessible and commercial. And then there was the jack-o'-lantern transformation. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit. In Ireland and Scotland, people carved turnips to make lanterns. Have you seen a carved turnip? They're absolutely terrifying. Hollow, grotesque, nightmare fuel. So these Irish immigrants came to America and discovered pumpkins, which are much bigger and easier to carve. Yeah, pumpkins are an American thing. So jack-o'-lanterns became a pumpkin thing. The practice is Irish, the pumpkin is American. Neat cultural blending of these traditions it's fun, it's interesting for me. So by the 1980s, Halloween had become a major commercial holiday with entire industries built around decorations, costumes, and candy. Adult costume parties became popular again, bringing back that Victorian adult celebration aspect, but with a modern twist, of course. And now, in 2025, Halloween is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the second largest commercial holiday after Christmas. So let's be clear about what came from where, because this matters for understanding. So some ancient practices that we can absolutely document. Bonfires, fire rituals, feasting and community gathering, livestock slaughter, marking the end of the harvest time and the beginning of winter, some form of ancestor acknowledgement or spirit acknowledgement, and of course agricultural functions during this time of year. Then we have medieval folklore era practices, which are stories about supernatural beings with thin veils, divination rituals, though specific forms are debated and discussed and vary from culture to culture. The idea of disguises and mumming and the purposes of that vary by region, of course, as well. And connections to the dead becoming very much more explicit. Then we jump into the 1840s to the early 1900s. We get the Victorian inventions of the romantic parlor games, the bobbing for apples, the Gothic party aesthetic, matchmaking, social gathering format specifically for adults. And then we get into the 20th century, and we get trick-or-treating and candy-focused celebration and children's holidays. We started bringing children into it at this time. And then, of course, the mass-produced costumes, decoration, and the whole commercial Halloween industry. So when someone says that Halloween is an ancient Celtic tradition, about bobbing for apples, you can say, well, no, bobbing for apples is Victorian, and all these other things. When somebody, asks about carving pumpkins and saying it's an ancient practice, you can say, well, the concept of the scary lantern is Irish and ancient, but the pumpkins specifically are American. Understanding these different layers doesn't make Halloween less meaningful. It actually makes it richer and more culturally diverse. It's a living tradition that's been evolving for 3,000 years. Each era adds something new. That's not corruption of the original. That's just culture and how culture works. And I'll take this moment to like elaborate on this a little bit more, and it comes with different pagan practices. You have some people that, like I've demonstrated these different levels of history of how like this season has evolved. Pagan practices have done the same. You have some people that will focus on a very specific time frame of their pagan beliefs, and anything outside of that is wrong, or they'll argue against it. But when you really look at paganism as a whole, it has evolved with culture. Even then, they didn't say that this was the only way to do it. They understood that like it wasn't religion to them, it was their culture, it was their customs, it was everything they did kind of rolled into one, and why they did it, and they attached spiritual meaning onto it. It doesn't mean that we have to be stuck in that one time frame. We can evolve into something that's a little bit bigger, a little bit more than what we are. We are a combination of our culture, it's our customs, it's what we do. So I just want to like put that in there and help people understand that just because you're a specific type of pagan doesn't mean you have to follow strict rules. You can if you want to, but it's not required. Okay, I'll step off my soapbox and continue with the Samhain. So you may ask, who actually celebrates Samhain as a religious holy day in 2025? Well, there are two different approaches because there's a lot of diversity here, as I mentioned. It's important to understand that not all pagans celebrate in the same way. You have Wiccans. Samhain is known as the witch's new year to some, and it's the most important greater Sabbath in the wheel of the year for them. They kind of focus on the spooky aesthetic for the most part. Modern Wiccan celebrations blend Gerald Gardner's 1950s framework, which continues with more continuously evolving practices. Gardner essentially founded Wicca in England in the mid-20th century. Drawing from ceremonial magic, Freemasonry, and various folklore sources, a lot of it came from the Welsh. Wiccan Samhain typically includes casting circles using the four elements to create a sacred space, invoking the god and goddess, with the god passing into the underworld and the goddess entering her crone aspect. Again, the crone like approaching death in the underworld. Silent suppers were where a place is set for a deceased loved ones, often served in reverse order for some reason. I'm not sure of that. There are elaborate ancestor altars with photographs, keepsakes, and offerings. Again, kind of pulling from a lot of these ancient traditions from around the world. There's divination work, during this veil thinning era where you have a little bit better connection with the other world. And shadow work and introspection for personal transformation are very popular during this time of year. And here's something important. Wiccan Samhain is modern. It was created in the 50s, but that doesn't make it invalid or fake. It's a meaningful spiritual practice for millions of people worldwide. And they've blended this modern stuff with some ancient practices as well. Wiccans in the southern hemisphere celebrate Samhain in late April, early May, because they're entering winter at that time. So this shows how modern paganism adapts to actual seasonal reality more than just copying dates. Because in the springtime, it wouldn't make sense to represent moving into a winter season when you're actually moving into your summer. So keep that in mind. Celtic Reconstructionism takes a very different approach. Celtic Reconstruction practitioners often emphasize rigorous historical accuracy, as I mentioned. They look at archaeological evidence and cultural specificity. They recognize that Samhain is specifically Irish and Scottish Gaelic and not Pan-Celtic. Many study Celtic languages as a core spiritual practice and really focus on the pronunciations of these words that I may have butchered. They focus more on the three realms cosmology, like land, sea, and sky, instead of the four elements. Their sacred space is found in nature, not created through a ritual like the Wiccans. And individual deities are represented as distinct beings, not just a simple archetypal of god and goddess duality. And of course, they have their own ethics based on Celtic honor culture, truth, courage, hospitality, justice, rather than the simple Wiccan read of harm none. Then there's the Celtic celebrations of Samhain Eve. They look different from the Wiccan practices. It's more large tribal gatherings, athletic competitions like the Norse, music, loud feasting. The duration usually spans about a week, about 3 days before and 3 days after this time. And then they leave offerings outside for the Aishi and the ancestors. So for the fairies and the ancestors. They do something called juniper seining, which is it's kind of like sage smudging, but more culturally appropriate. For their homes is a way of purification. And usually they'll have two bonfires where they'll pass between them for cleansing. So I'm just hitting these top level things. I'm not going to get into detail of the specifics about these practices. If you want to learn more about Celtic Reconstruction beliefs, definitely follow the channel. Check out our Discord server. We can get into those deeper discussions. And of course, other types of divination with stones and fires. It's again, we can get into that a little bit later. But here's a crucial difference. Celtic feasts are boisterous and loud, not silent. Historic Celtic Samhain involved athletic competitions, games, raucous celebration. The Silent Supper is a modern Wiccan invention or innovation. And also, Celtic practitioners often time their celebrations based on local landmarkers, like when the first frost comes, when harvest actually completes in their area, or when specific plants start changing, leaves falling, that sort of thing, rather than focus on a specific calendar date. This represents the authentic Celtic practices and not, following a specific calendar. There are some modern Druid orders, like the OBOD, is the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, or the ADF, and I will not pronounce that name. They balance historical inspiration with some more modern relevance. The Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids describes Samhain as a festival of the dead, a festival of remembrance, or when past, present, and future become one. They're explicit that they're not simply doing reenactment, they're creating a living spiritual practice informed by those ancient historical practices. Druid celebrations often include, like the other things, public rituals at sacred sites like Stonehenge, collaborative community-created ceremonies rather than scripted performances. They usually share things like poetry, music, and storytelling as a core spiritual practice. It goes into more of the Druid, like teaching and learning and sharing these things with each other through oral traditions. And of course, there's typically some environmental activism that's included in that. And even in the modern world, there's even virtual celebrations. On the Pagan Temple Discord server, we're going to have a live video and chat where we can kind of get into these things as well. Remember, modern Druids tend to emphasize the philosophical and artistic aspects of Celtic tradition alongside their spiritual practice. And if you're interested in experiencing Samhain celebrations, there are now professional level public festivals around the world, particularly in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, and in the U.S. There's festivals that happen all over the U.S. for that. Like the Spirit Haven Samhain Festival in Texas runs for several days on a huge ranch. It includes community rituals, workshops, concerts, drum circles, and even a memorial grove for honoring the dead. I even think they have a community ofrenda inspired by Dia de los Muertos, with it being in Texas, and it's culturally appropriate there. And even heard someone mention that they even have a Hellenic temple for cross-cultural connections. There's the Florida Pagan Gathering, runs for a few days with camping, workshops, and herbalism, ritual craft, vendor marketplaces, ritual traditions represented, a lot of other things like that. And these events, I just mentioned a couple, but they show that the professionalization and the diversification of modern paganism. They're family friendly, they emphasize accessibility for newcomers, and they focus on community care and attract hundreds of attendees, thousands of attendees every year. Something I want you to understand. These are all different, they're all valid, and none of them is more authentic than another. Wicca is modern, created in the 50s. This doesn't make it fake. It's sincere spiritual practice that works for millions of people. Celtic Reconstructionism, Norse Reconstructionism, also true, is typically more scholarly and evidence-based. This doesn't make it better or more legitimate. It's just a different approach. Druidry balances accessibility with historical inspiration with more philosophical approaches. That's not watered down. It's intentionally inclusive. What matters is sincerity, respect, and understanding what you're actually practicing. Understanding is a core tenet at the Pagan Temple, and it's what I'm trying to help people understand. Just don't claim ancient lineage if you're practicing Wicca. It's modern. That's fine. Don't mix pantheons and cosmologies randomly, like one god from this, one god from that, one tradition from this culture, and just mix them all up without understanding them and being culturally appropriate for that. Don't treat Irish deities as interchangeable with Greek gods just because they're both pagan. They both fall under this same wide umbrella. Each culture and each practice is separate. Just because we put it under one pagan umbrella doesn't mean that you can just mix and match everything together. The pagan umbrella just gives us a sense of community where we can share our ideas and get together and help understand each other. Even if we don't follow the exact same practices, there is that small level of understanding that comes with it. And please, please, please do not dismiss any of these practices as just playing dress up or cosplay or Halloween for adults, because for modern pagans, Samhain is genuine religious holy day. It deserves the same respect as any other religious observance. And since we're on that subject, let me give you just a quick list of common mistakes that people make about Samhain. Mistake number one, as I mentioned earlier, it's the pronunciation. It's either Samhain or Samhain, depending on cultural and linguistic differences, not Samhain. Unless you want every Irish person within earshot to judge you silently or boisterously. Mistake number two, mixing different traditions or conflating two different traditions. Like Wicca and Celtic Reconstructionism, like I said, are not the same thing. It's like saying Catholics and Muslims are the same. They celebrate some of the same festivals or holidays, maybe, but they're very different. Theology, practices, and their understanding of the world are different. Mistake number three, the satanic claim. Samhain is not satanic, it's not demonic, it's not evil. Satan is a Christian concept, a Christian god. Pagans do not believe in Satan, let alone worship the guy. This claim is offensive and has been debunked over and over and over again. Samhain is not a satanic holiday. There's nothing about Samhain that has anything to do with Satan unless it's a kid dressing up as the guy. For mistake number four, treating it as just Halloween for adults. For modern pagans, this is a genuine religious observance. It's not a costume party with a little mysticism thrown in. Please respect that. Mistake number five, cultural appropriation without engagement. If you're going to claim you practice Celtic spirituality, learn at least the basic Irish and Scottish words, understand the traditions, the stories, and where it all comes from. Support these living Celtic communities and language preservations. Engage with actual Celtic culture, not just the mythology. Don't treat it as a spiritual buffet where you take the parts of it that look good to you and leave all the deep, meaningful stuff behind. This bar isn't high. You can learn these things. You have a computer, a phone, a tablet that has the entire combination of human knowledge at your fingertips. Learn the cultures that you're wanting to experience and learn them in depth. Again, this bar isn't high, but it does exist. So let's bring all this together. Next time you're bobbing for apples, remember you're participating in a divination ritual to see who you'll marry. It's a Victorian adaptation of older Celtic practices. When you carve a pumpkin, you're performing an adapted Irish tradition of making lanterns to ward off the Dullahan and other spirits Though Irish use the terrifying carved turnips, not pumpkins, the pumpkins is an American thing, so you have that cultural connection. When you tell ghost stories in the dark, you're doing what people have done at this time of year for thousands and thousands of years, acknowledging that something about late October makes that boundary between life and death just a little bit thinner. And when you celebrate Halloween, whether secularly or spiritually, you're part of a tradition that connects Neolithic astronomers who built New Grange, Celtic warriors who defended Tara, medieval monks who recorded ancient stories, Victorian partygoers who played matchmaking games, Irish immigrants who brought traditions to America, and modern pagans all around the world who honor their ancestors and mark this turning of the seasons. The line between ancient and modern isn't as clear and defined as you might think, because here's the truth. Samhain isn't some museum piece that was preserved at one point in history and time. It's not a dead tradition we're observing from a distance through a glass wall. It's a living tradition, it's a living practice that has been continuously evolving, adapting, and growing for millennia. The stories change, new ones are added, and old ones are reinterpreted. These practices evolve as cultures blend and people move. The meanings shift as contexts change, but the core of all this remains, marking the threshold between light and dark, honoring those who came before us, preparing for what lies ahead, and coming together as a community when the days grow short and cold. That's what Samhain has always been about. Whether you're a Neolithic farmer anxiously counting your food stores, a Celtic warrior at a 3-day tribal gathering, a medieval Christian attending All Saints' Mass, a Victorian young woman trying to glimpse her future husband in the mirror, an Irish immigrant in the 1920s America, or a modern pagan casting a Wiccan circle in 2025. You're all doing the same essential thing. You're acknowledging this transitional time. You're honoring memories. You're facing darkness with your community and with meaning. And personally, that's fucking beautiful. Whether you celebrate Samhain as a religious holy day, enjoy Halloween as a secular holiday, or just like candy corn in scary movies, you're part of something ancient, something global, and something genuinely magical. So on this October 31st, whether you choose to mark it, however you choose to mark it, you're connected to 3,000 plus years of human beings looking at the dying season, feeling that liminal threshold energy and deciding to light a fire against the darkness. And that is worth celebrating. If you want to learn more about pagan practices and different spiritual traditions, check out the Pagan Temple's website. We've got comprehensive educational content covering all these different topics. More is added every week, all taught with respect for the history, with respect for the culture and cultural sensitivity, and of course with accessibility for beginners. Please join our Discord community, links in the bio or in the description down below, where we have conversations about all this stuff, the history, the modern practice, the questions, the debates. It's a welcoming space for everyone from complete beginners to experienced practitioners. If you're watching this video before Samhain 2025, definitely get into our Discord server, because on that date or somewhere nearby, we're going to have a live where we'll just be doing questions and answers based on Samhain and just having a discussion as a community. So I'm going to ask you, what's your favorite Samhain or Halloween tradition? Put it in the comments down below. Have you ever celebrated one as a spiritual holy day? What stories from your own cultural background connect to this time of year? Is there something personal to your family that you want to share? I'd love to hear it. I love learning about these new cultures. And I'm begging you, stop saying Samhain. There's an Irish guy out there that's going to club you in the head if you keep saying it. Thanks for watching. Happy Samhain, blessed Samhain, or just happy fucking Halloween. However you want to say it. May your autumn be beautiful, your winter survivable, and your ancestors honored. I'll see you in the next video.